Well, first of all, can I just say how tremendously honoured I am to receive this honorary degree. I was so touched when I heard that my name was being put forward, and it's a tremendous honour for me. And thank you for all the kind words that you have said about my work. I really appreciate it. So thank you to Professor Zagorakis and the Economics Department and to the university for making this happen. It's wonderful, thank you. It's also given me the opportunity to visit Thessaly, which is a first for me, and to meet all of you. Like so many people, I was horrified to see the news stories about the floods here. I mean, what a terrible time the region's been through. I can't imagine what it must have been like. But can I just congratulate Professor Zagorakis and the department of the university for putting on an event like this in spite of all the difficulties that you've had to contend with. It's most impressive that you've made this happen, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, the topic I've chosen for today is Adam Smith and behavioural economics. Now, Adam Smith is well known for being concerned with the way in which societies and economies evolve, and therefore taps in very much to discussions about the effects of AI. But why behavioural economics? Well, if we're thinking about AI, talking about artificial intelligence, and we're concerned about any implications of attempting to either replicate or enhance human intelligence, it's quite useful, I think, to go back to thinking about what human intelligence actually is and how far artificial intelligence does mirror it or can even enhance it. And this is a subject for behavioural economics. And when I talk about behavioural economics, I'll be referring mainly to new behavioural economics, which is what emerged from the 1980s. I'm sorry, I should have asked for the next slide. And behavioural economics was concerned to address actual behaviour. I mean, it seems odd, why on earth weren't economists trying to do that anyway? But what they observed through their experiments was that even within an isolated situation, individuals would behave in a different way from what would be predicted by the narrow model of strict rationality. So we have a departure here. First of all, an attempt to be realist, and second, a way of challenging something at the core of standard economics. But the focus, as I'll discuss shortly, turned very much towards rationality still, that was still the focus, even though the attempt was trying to explain deviations from rationality. And when we think about rationality, we're talking about analytical intelligence. Actually, human intelligence covers a much wider range. There's practical intelligence, creative intelligence, and what we'll discover is particularly significant is emotional intelligence. And these don't feature. It's the analytical intelligence that's the focus of mainstream economics, and as it turns out, to a considerable extent of behavioural economics. And this is where we come to Adam Smith, because he was concerned about human behaviour. And it's interesting that behavioural economists have referred back so much to Adam Smith. I mean, for such a long time, most economists associated Adam Smith with Wealth of Nations. But in the last few decades, and largely thanks to behavioural economists, there's been a lot more attention paid to his earlier work, the theory of moral sentiments. And there's an article in particular that was published in 2005 by leading behavioural economists who documented explicitly the various ways in which behavioural economics was picking up on ideas from Adam Smith. Not necessarily deliberately because of Adam Smith, but what they're identifying is that there are areas of commonality with Adam Smith. So they go through the various features like loss aversion, overconfidence, concern with fairness, all these features of actual behaviour which they've document as coming from the theory of moral sentiments. So the way in which they talk about these features is to couch them in terms of the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator was the imaginary figure that Adam Smith suggests governs our behaviour. That when we're thinking of making decisions, we have in the back of our minds the impartial spectator and what would this imaginary being think of what we're doing. And modern behavioural economists use this concept of the impartial spectator to explain and to motivate a lot of their theory. And this is where the confusion comes in a little, because in one paragraph they talk about the impartial spectator as a form of conscience. And this fits very well with much of what Adam Smith was talking about, that the impartial spectator is a moral arbiter. But then in other paragraphs they talk about the impartial spectator as the enforcer of rationality. And here they draw on a feature of psychology theory called dual process analysis, which suggests that when we're making decisions, we have sort of instinctive, reactive kind of behaviours in the short run, but in the longer run, we're more careful in our reasoning and come to what they put as much more rational decisions. So this is moving away from Adam Smith, for whom moral sentiments were central. And this poses a real problem for behavioural economics, how to deal with ethical decisions, the ethical dimensions of decisions. And ideally, if you wanted an artificial intelligence to mimic human intelligence, you'd want somehow to incorporate that. Now, their understanding of the impartial spectator was very different from Adam Smith's. And to understand Adam Smith, we have to understand him as a man of system. He's very, Andrew Skinner from Glasgow was very, wrote very influentially on Adam Smith's sense of system. And Adam Smith himself had his own system, that he was a philosopher, a moral philosopher. He wrote on rhetoric. He was a historian. He initiated a lot of psychological theory, and he was an economist. But it's all part and parcel of the same way of thinking. And his thinking in each of these areas draws on all of the others. And in turn, he thinks of the external world as a system, and indeed the internal world, whether we're talking about the material world or the social world. He understood it in terms of a system. And in particular, he understood reality as an open system. And this is something that I believe John Davis is going to be talking about tomorrow. The idea that reality is not something predetermined, but something that evolves in a complex way. There are causal processes at work, but as each evolution plays out, the world changes, and it changes in ways that we can't predict. There's fundamental uncertainty. And this feeds into another aspect of his system, which is his philosophy of science, which is the conclusion that we cannot demonstrate truth. We can do our best to build knowledge, but we can never actually demonstrate categorically that one theory has captured the truth. But that doesn't mean to say we don't do it. This is often a misconception of Hume, that he was such a skeptic that he said, that was the end of science. That was Kant's reading of him. Rather, it's to recognize the nature of reality and try to build up knowledge systems that suit that type of reality. And then, as scientists, you saw social sciences as part of the general, or you would have called it a philosophy, social philosophy. Our sentiments enter into this whole system of building knowledge that we construct. It comes in right at the beginning. Why do we try to build knowledge? Why do we want to know more about the way the world works? Well, we're curious. We have sentiments. We have the sense of awe and wonder at things that we can't explain. We want to try and explain them and understand the world better. And then sentiments enter in when we actually construct the theories, so that because we cannot hope to understand the full truth of the way the world works, we draw on social conventions to help us. So Hume, for example, pointed to the convention that there is existence, that the world exists, we exist. He said you can't prove it, but it's proved to be quite a useful hypothesis to work on for a few centuries. So let's just keep it until there's some sort of something that challenges that. And that's an extreme example, but in a lot of our knowledge building, we use social conventions about what's a good argument, what's a useful way of representing the world, and so on. And then our sentiments come into how we persuade others to accept our theories. We can't prove our theories to be best. Nobody can. So we have to persuade. And Smith was a great contributor to a theory of rhetoric, which focused on rhetoric with the purpose of persuasion. And this involved engaging with the sentiments of your audience, trying to work out what other scientists were thinking at the same time, and what would appeal to them, what would capture their imaginations, and therefore what would make your theory successful. So sentiments enter in at that point as well. So the impartial spectator, how does this imaginary being fit into all of this? Well, Smith understood individuals as being profoundly social beings. Rather than being isolated, atomistic units, individuals' nature came from their being in society. And so when we're considering future actions, we think of them in relation to society. How would others regard them? Would this, would an action be one of propriety? Would others respect us for this action or not? But it's not just a matter of sort of self-interest in gaining respect. It's also a matter of just being able to understand other people's perspective. What would other people think of a particular action? But also, what do we think about other people's thoughts about our actions? Smith talked a lot about sympathy, but this wasn't just compassion, although it included compassion. It was a matter of getting into other people's heads in a way. I mean, this is a foundation for a lot of the thinking about pluralism, is this capacity to try and see things from other people's points of view. So that the impartial spectator, far from being an enforcer of rationality, was an imaginary being who took on board all our moral sentiments and helped us to effectuate them. So if we have moral goals, the impartial spectator will help us judge whether how we're about to act will actually help us pursue those goals. I mean, he didn't think that all sentiments were good, and he saw sentiments as governing all our behaviour. I mean, sometimes if we were what he called engaging in self-love rather than other regarding behaviour, this could go too far and was to be discouraged. He also argued against people being too passionate in their sentiments, expressing themselves in extreme ways. And the reason he gave for discouraging that was that it would discourage other people's sympathy with us. I mean, I think this would be an interesting kind of idea to develop now, given the sort of the current culture wars, which seem to thrive on very strongly expressed sentiments. I mean, Smith was very much aware that the world changes. In a way, this was at the core of the way he thought and the way he used history. That he tried to tease out theories about how things worked, but was always acutely aware that these might not survive as the world moved on. And you have to sort of constantly be aware of how well ideas fit with a particular circumstance. So his methodology, in other words, how he actually went about theorizing himself, owed a lot to Newton, and particularly to the Scottish Enlightenment interpretation of Newton, which was unusual at the time. And this involved the use of abductive logic, taking experimental evidence, which in Newton's case was physical evidence. In Smith's case, it was massive reading of history, reading about different circumstances and as case studies. And drawing out of this, using the imagination and using metaphor and other techniques, patterns, trying to identify patterns. And I was interested to note in an earlier presentation the idea that AI tries to identify patterns. Thank you. Smith was talking about people using their imagination to do that, but I guess there is scope for routinizing that to a considerable extent. And AI may itself use abductive logic as well, go back to new circumstances to try to check whether the patterns actually make sense or whether they need to be adapted. Now, referring back to another of the papers earlier this afternoon, Smith had the view that the kind of knowledge that we develop in this way is social knowledge. And I mean, not only is it the product of social relations, but it succeeds or fails according to power relations. And he explored this in terms of astronomy and the way in which there was such a struggle in the Middle Ages for new theories of astronomy to gain a hold, given new evidence. And the bottom line of his approach to knowledge is that cognition and sentiment are profoundly interrelated, that you can't separate out sentiments from knowledge and cognition, and particularly from reasoning, from rationality. Which is very different from behavioural economics, which does seek to separate cognition and sentiment. I mean, I suggested earlier that the view of the impartial spectator is of a being which takes short-term decision-making on the basis of sentiment and corrects it to make it rational. And this notion of separation is endemic in mainstream methodology. Now, I said that new behavioural economists challenged mainstream economics, but nevertheless, they very explicitly adhere to mainstream economics and its methodology in the sense of regarding it as being at the core of economics. So what they see themselves doing is helping to make the rational economic man concept much more complex and much more capable of dealing with what they're observing in experiments. So it's very much a Lactosian process. There's the hardcore of rational economic man. Behavioural economics is trying to build up a protective belt to deal with the evidence that they keep coming up with to falsify the rational economic man concept. And because of sticking to mainstream methodology, inevitably almost, these results that they come across and the ways in which they theorize about them are treated as anomalies. The benchmark is rationality, strict rationality. Anything else must be an anomaly, or it must be a bias, somehow distorting human behavior. So in a way, it's really trying to sort of, as Lactors would say, shore up the model. And there are two types of explanation for anomalies emerging, for biases. One is that they are actually rational anyway, that we have cognitive limitations as human beings, we have data limitations. There's some reason that makes it difficult to make strictly rational decisions. Therefore, we take shortcuts. We use heuristics as a cognitive device, and we do so rationally. And it's the heuristics that throw up the anomalies because it's not done on the basis of strict rationality. As Peter Earle explains in one of the books that was mentioned earlier, actually this doesn't make sense, because if you're trying to optimize the use of resources in order to make decisions, you've got to know what it is you don't know to work out what's rational. So that's a wee bit tricky. But an example of a cognitive shortcut is trust. It's very resource intensive to try and gather information about other people or institutions to try and work out when and where trust is warranted. In other words, to engage in rational market interrelations. So if we learn to trust somebody with whom we engage in economic activity, then we don't have to go through this process of trying to work out exactly why we trust them. But it's couched as a rational decision, a calculated decision in self-interest. There's really reinforcing the standard model. And it's very different from Smith's treatment of trust, which was that it's a social convention which society forms over many years and much experience, and is better understood at the social level rather than the individual level. The other set of explanations for these biases is that they are irrational, and it's due to emotion. We let our emotions run away with ourselves in the first instance when we're making decisions, and that takes us away from the rational outcome. And the conclusion is that we need policies to try and help us to be a bit more rational, nudge us in that direction. Now, how could Smith help behavioural economists do what it seems that they actually want to do? Because when you read these articles, a lot of it sounds very compatible with Smith, and then it sort of deviates off into a focus on rationality. Well, for a start, the notion of system is limited very much to the mainstream abstract system based on rational economic man. There's no theory of mind there. Behavioural economists draw on psychology, which could provide a theory of mind, but it doesn't go there. It sort of goes back to the rational economic man benchmark. There could be more analysis of heuristics in terms of social conventions. And there are various pieces of work which, by Etzioni, for example, on moral goals, hierarchies of goals, which could be used within the framework of behavioural economics, rather than having a sort of linear single goal which governed all behaviour. And that again would be drawing on Adam Smith. And really, we need that if we're going to have some really comprehensive account of human intelligence within behavioural economics that covers the sort of range of intelligence that I've referred to earlier. But what has to happen is to get rid of this benchmark of rational economic man. It's that which keeps constraining behavioural economics as far as I can see. You know, there's so much that's useful there, and yet there's this insistence that it's got to somehow fit into the mainstream framework. And that's the lesson I draw from thinking about all these things, that there's a lot of scope for progress within behavioural economics, but it can only really happen if the strings that tie it to mainstream methodology and the mainstream rational economic man model were cut. So, thank you.